Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Could I just ask for a few attendees just to add a little comment that you're able to hear me, and we will get started here. Perfect. I love it. Love when I can see, yes, I can hear you. So Angela's already rushing us through the slides, I see, but we'll just back it up to the first one and just welcome everyone. We are going through our second presentation on Module 3, which is Election Finances and Contribution Disclosure. I believe the slides were emailed out with the Zoom link, so you guys are able to follow along and hopefully make some notes as we go through this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jennifer Muskowski, and I am a municipal advisor here at Municipal Affairs, and with me is Angela Bilski, who presented Modules 1 and 2. And I have to give a big shout out to my IT support who keeps us looking good. It's got Kevin Miller and Lucien Cloutier here. And Kevin did a great job last week in keeping our presentation moving. So I didn't need to pull a Catherine O'Hara from Home Alone and scream Kevin, but he is on the ready if something comes up today. So also please keep your webcam off and your microphone muted, as this will help improve the quality of the presentation and limit that potential interruptions. So we're able to turn off any videos, so no worries if you have a furry family member or someone like that jump on your lap, but that message is really just more for me because I'll become totally distracted with all your little fur balls stealing the show. As well, we also have Elections Alberta with us, who will be providing some further information on their role in the process. And I know that temptation to open an email or surf the web is easy when we're attending a Zoom presentation. However, I trust I will keep your interest as we go through today's information. And just from a privacy perspective, and to ensure everyone is aware, we are recording this session so we can post it online for future reference. And I want to thank you again as we continue our online learning sessions for the 2021 Local Authority General Elections. So on to the next screen with our proposed election training modules. So the layout of the training modules has been revised slightly from what we proposed in late 2020. Municipal Affairs wants to be sure returning officers have the information in hand at the appropriate time and that you're able to answer any potential questions you may be faced with. We have had a few questions on campaign disclosures as candidates are beginning to expend funds on their campaigns. As well, there is the potential for candidates to withdraw, and returning officers need to know that process that will take place. So of course, we have not skipped over any modules, and we will continue to ensure that the returning officers are fully prepared as this election year progresses. So I do refer to websites throughout the presentation, and Kevin is posting those links in the chat box now, so you may want to just copy those for your reference. We also do have a resource slide at the end that we will go through before we end the session off. So we're going to look at the next slide, which is highlights of our previous session. So that's modules 1 and 2. I'll just give a recap of those for everyone's reference. And we've posted the recordings of both module 1 and 2 on YouTube if you wanted to review what was presented. So you just search Municipal Elections Your Alberta, and they will be listed in the collection of videos. So a recap of module 1 here. We discussed the roles and responsibilities of the returning officer, the substitute returning officer, councils, CAOs, and the minister. We touched on considerations for bylaws and resolutions that can be made with respect to election processes. So many timelines have passed, but councils can still determine provisions for advanced voting opportunities if your population is under 5,000, for an allowance for special ballots, providing at-home and institutional votes, printing ballots in lots, voting station hours, list of electors, using tabulators, counting centers, etc. So please refer to a new checklist and calendar resource found on the Municipal Elections Overview website for the timelines. We discussed some considerations for conducting elections during a pandemic, such as extra materials and staffing that may be required. We are working on a resource for municipalities to navigate how to carry out election processes while following all of the public health orders and guidelines. The need for certain modifications will continue to be monitored and reviewed to ensure municipalities will have the appropriate ability to align election operations with public health orders or recommendations. We introduced the likelihood of Senate election and referendum votes being held in conjunction with the general election on October 18th, and what that could mean for municipalities. Recordings of Elections Alberta's sessions of the first two modules are available on the Elections Alberta website. There's also a very detailed information sheet on that site, which explains who will be responsible for what during these provincial votes. And there's Module 1 in a snapshot. And moving on to Module 2, we outlined the nomination procedure as the nomination period began on January 1st, 2021. Formal advertising of the start of nomination period was not required, but more informal notification methods such as a newsletter, website, and social media were recommended. A ministerial order was put in effect to enable nomination deposits to also be paid by debit or credit card. So we're also getting many questions on who can administer the oath on the nomination form. So only a returning officer, a commissioner for oaths, a notary public, or a presiding deputy returning officer can administer the oath on the form. Municipalities are not required to commission the forms, and candidates can find their own notary public or commissioner to perform that function. A returning officer or their delegate can sign the very bottom of the form to indicate that it has been accepted. Many municipal offices have closed or reduced their hours to align with the orders of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. In addition to delivering nomination forms in person, the specific requirement of Section 28 of the LEEA to submit nomination forms to the local jurisdiction office can be met by having forms mailed or delivered by courier. Nomination forms can also be accepted at specific times set by the returning officer, by appointment, or at a secure drop-off box. This is provided that the forms are fully completed, commissioned, and accompanied by a certified check or money order. We described the limited reasons for which nomination forms can be rejected. Some examples could be they didn't use the prescribed form, they did not collect enough signatures, the form was not commissioned, and was not accompanied by the deposit, if applicable. We're getting a lot of questions from municipalities about the viewing of their nomination papers, as well as questions on the posting of candidates' names. As these questions have been asked multiple times of our office, I really need to have your undivided attention as we go through these next few bullets. So there are three provisions that I'll address separately regarding the nomination of candidates. So first, the viewing of the submitted nomination papers. Number two, the posting of the names of candidates after nomination day. And number three, acclaimed candidates. So number one being nomination forms must be available for public inspection at the municipal office according to Section 28, subsection 6. So this is not the municipality publicly posting or releasing names. It's an opportunity for someone to make the effort to inspect the submitted nomination forms. So Section 28, subsection 6 of the LEEA provides upon the start of the nomination period, which was January 1st, 2021, until the term of office has expired, October 2025, a person may request to examine the submitted nomination papers. This is during regular business hours and in the presence of the returning officer, deputy returning officer, or secretary. This is the only way electors or other candidates have the opportunity to view nomination information if there are any considerations of challenging eligibility through the courts. Municipalities would need to look at their own operational practices to determine a way to comply with the viewing of nomination papers in a manner that takes into account the COVID-19 precautions. So, number two, the municipality publicly posting candidates' names before the legislated timeline. The legislative requirement is through Section 28, subsection 10, which states, within 48 hours after the close of nominations, the returning officer shall post the names of all candidates and the office they are running for. If municipalities wish to post publicly the names of candidates that have submitted their papers before 48 hours after the close of nomination day, they may wish to determine if there are any FOIP considerations needed to be addressed, such as getting consent from the candidate in advance. And the third is section 34, subsection 4. It speaks to acclaimed candidates. The returning officer retains all submitted nomination papers until the term of office applied for relates. So if you apply for a councillor seat and whether you win, lose, or even withdraw before nomination day, the returning officer will still retain those papers for public viewing until October 2025. Questions have arisen around the need for a policy on the release of candidates' names. However, legislation provides for the public inspection of nomination forms after submission and the public posting of candidates' names 48 hours after the close of nomination date. If decisions are made that exceed these minimum requirements of the LAEA, it is recommended the municipality ensure they mitigate any other concerns that may arise, such as FOIP consent for the early publication of names, for example. So a recent legislative amendment was Bill 45. It recently came into force, which looks at eliminating any municipal bylaw which moved election day to a Saturday and third-party advertising contribution limits and penalties. So that was your highlights of modules 1 and 2. So we're going to move now to the slide that talks about forms. So the local authority's election forms regulation is now available on the Queen's Printer website. You may use the wording in this regulation to create forms that are tailored to each municipality's circumstances, including a municipal logo, or to increase the number of signatures required for nominations, etc. But before printing forms from the municipal election forms website, you should review the regulation for possible updated versions. New versions of the forms will gradually be added to the municipal election forms page according to their priority in the elections process. Continue to watch the municipal election website for these updated forms. The forms on the municipal elections page are provided in a fillable format. There are instances in which you may encounter what is called an XDP format. We wanted to run through how those XDP forms are completed, as they're slightly different than your regular PDF fillable. If you do encounter an XDP format, and you're able to tell this by the extension identified in brackets at the end of the link of the form, so it'll be either XDP or PDF. That XDP format allows the user to save the form once they have started filling it out and continue filling it out at a later date. So this is a different process than saving a PDF. You will not require any special program to use the XDP as it is web-based, meaning all you require is internet access. So if we look to the slide, we can walk through how this process is completed. So you'd open the form, start entering in your information. When you're at a point which you need to save and return at a later time, you'd click on that save button on the bottom corner. A message box will appear and you will enter in your email address. Again, click save in that bottom corner and a following message will appear letting you know your document has been saved. You will receive an email to the inbox that you provided. And here you want to click on the link in the email. You don't want to click on that PDF attachment as it will not take you to that fillable PDF. Only the link will take you to the document. And just want to mention that on the elections form website, Form 5 is currently a disabled link. We are working to reinstate the PDF version of this document so everyone is able to access it. So as we go through this module, please feel free, use that chat box for your questions. I've got Lucien in the background. He will happily ensure that we capture all of those questions and we will respond during the question period at the end. So let's get into the election finances and campaign disclosure. So this is part 5.1 of the LAEA. A few high points to note on the changes that are now in place are all campaign finance provisions now apply to school board candidates. I'll just repeat it because I know that might be unknown to some, but all campaign finance provisions now apply to school board candidates. Candidates are required to disclose names and addresses of donors whose contributions exceed $50, and candidates who incur campaign expenses or contributions of $50,000 or more must file a review engagement document. Financial disclosure statements are required from all candidates, even if a candidate was fully self-funded, spent $0 on a campaign, or withdraws at some time in the campaign period. So keyword in that sentence was all. Financial disclosure statements are required from all candidates. So of course, we need audience participation as we go. And we had great feedback from Thursday as we threw a couple polls into our presentation. So that means I'm sticking with it. If it's not broken, just let it go. So that's right. As I said, audience participation. It's cold out and you need to exercise your extremities. So I'm putting you to work. So this poll is going to ask how many municipalities have already received nomination forms. So Angela is pulling up the poll and I can see that you guys don't even need me. Look at that. You're already answering. So that's great. So we'll give that a couple seconds here to let a few more people answer. And then we will end that polling off. And we will share our results. So it appears that we've got a consistent response as what we had from last week. So a majority of municipalities have not received any nomination forms yet. Which is perfectly fine. So what we did was we actually continued to utilize that chat box. There are some municipalities that have received nominations. So if you guys are willing to offer up what you've done, if you've done anything different, kind of an out of the box idea on how you were getting that message out. Last week, obviously the more common answers were going to be social media, local newspapers. But if you've done something different, I always say it takes a village. So if you can share and learn from each other, why not? We're going to work smarter, not harder. So as I said, use that chat box if you want to offer up something different. So our next slide is getting started on legislation and resources. And I know this is always sometimes an eye-rolling slide, but it's important. We want to ensure that everyone is using the correct legislation. We've all heard of instances in which the Election Act was referenced and not the Local Authorities Election Act. And as a returning officer, it's your #1 task to make sure you are using the correct legislation. You don't want to go through this process trying to make the Election Act fit. So please ensure you are referencing the most recent copy of all legislation and the appropriate legislation. So the most recent MGA is September 2020. The most recent LAEA is September 1st, 2020. However, there were amendments through Bill 45 that you want to be aware of. And Alberta Queen's Printer has what you need if you're questioning the versions you currently have at the office. So we'll move on to responsibilities. So the responsibilities of contributors and the role they play in the campaign of a candidate, financial duties of a candidate, fundraising efforts of a candidate, issuing of receipts, expense limits, deficits, and late filing of deficit disclosure statements. These are all the pieces of the puzzle that make up the financial picture of a candidate's election campaign. I feel that I've done so many puzzles during COVID that they're beginning to creep into my presentation. So I don't know about you guys, but we contributed to the shortage of puzzles. So the next slide is the responsibilities of contributors. So before a prospective contributor makes a contribution, they must ensure they are not prohibited from doing so and ensure they are not in excess of the limits prescribed. This is a sentence you want to be aware of. A contributor is responsible to ensure they are not prohibited and they have not made a donation in excess of the limits prescribed. We will highlight those limits in an upcoming slide for everyone's awareness. A candidate's role in this process is to make every reasonable effort to advise prospective contributors of the provisions of this part. It is also the candidate's responsibility to ensure they do not accept prohibited contributions or contributions exceeding the limits. As a candidate, one may want to verify with their contributor before they accept the contribution. The candidate should work to ensure due diligence. One could also look to their campaign site or social media pages for disclaimers to get that message out before the contribution is made. The candidate may not be making a full-on public service announcement, but they may wish to have a quick link for reference, or if you're creative, TikTok always amazes me, so maybe you can think of something like that. But since COVID, the creative side to our brains have been pushed into hyperspeed, coming up with new ideas to socialize but remain socially distanced. So think outside that box to communicate your messaging. And as I said, though, the legislation does require that candidates shall make a reasonable effort. So limitations on contributors. Only an individual Albertan may make a contribution to a candidate. No prohibited organization and no individual resident from outside Alberta shall make a contribution. A prohibited organization is a corporation and an unincorporated organization, including a trade union and an employee organization. So trade union is an organization of employees that has a written constitution, rules, or bylaw. An employee organization is an organization other than a trade union that bargains collectively for employees. So a prohibited organization could be a municipally controlled corporation. A trade union could be UA Local 488 plumbers and pipe fitters, and an employee organization could be QP. So during the campaign period, an Albertan cannot contribute more than $5,000 to any candidate for election as a councillor and $5,000 to any candidate for election as a school board trustee. You can donate to multiple candidates, but you cannot exceed $5,000 per candidate. During the campaign period, a candidate may contribute up to $10,000 that is not reimbursed to the candidate from the campaign account by the end of the campaign period to the candidate's own campaign expense. This is considered a contribution to the candidate's own campaign. So if we break that down, a candidate can contribute $10,000 of their own funds towards their campaign expenses without being reimbursed. And this would be a contribution to the campaign. One piece to note is a candidate may ask if they can contribute to a running mate. They could, as there is nothing in legislation that prohibits this, as they are an Albertan. So as it stands today, there is no limit to campaign expenses. This means that a candidate may spend any amount they deem appropriate. But as we just went over, there is a limit to contributions. So if a candidate spends more than collected, they'll end up with a deficit. But before those questions on deficits come flying in, we will get there, I promise, just in a couple more slides. But right now, we're talking about the contributions being received. So no candidate or a person acting on behalf of a candidate shall directly or indirectly solicit or accept a contribution from a prospective contributor if it is from a prohibited organization or a non-Alberta resident. And no candidate or a person acting on behalf of a candidate shall solicit or accept a contribution if the candidate or person knows or ought to know the amount of the contribution will exceed the limits. So moving on to the next slide. So the campaign period in the year of a general election is January 1st to December 31st. I did mention this earlier, but if that statement just blew your mind and you're thinking to yourself, hey, that is now, you'd be correct. We are currently within the campaign period for the 2021 general election. So outside the campaign period, a person cannot accept more than $5,000 in the aggregate, the total per year, in contributions. And a candidate cannot contribute more than $10,000 in the aggregate, the total per year again, to the candidate's campaign fund from the candidate's personal funds. So outside the campaign period is January 1st, 2022 through to December 31st, 2024. So $5,000 contributions plus $10,000 of the candidate's own personal contribution is $15,000 per year to the campaign. So over 3 years, that's $45,000 one can collect in preparation for the next campaign period in 2025. But we're going to focus on just the 2021 election at this point. I will speak to it later, but there is a provision to allow candidates to collect an additional contribution outside the campaign period to eliminate a deficit. If a candidate collected contributions within the campaign period of September 1st to December 31st, 2020, they cannot accept any further contributions until the nomination paper has been filed. This is because we are currently in the 2021 campaign period, and a person must be nominated in order to accept a contribution or incur a campaign expense. So if a person collected $15,000 between September 1st and December 31st, they cannot accept or incur expenses until the nomination paper has been filed. So if a candidate has contributions that were collected between January 1st, 2018 and December 11th, 2018, that was the date that Bill 23 received royal assent, the contribution is deemed to be collected in the 2021 campaign period. And this comes from section 147.94 subsection 3. So hopefully everyone was listening carefully to this section, because it's time for another quick poll. And bonus, you don't have to stress about making eye contact with the facilitator and getting picked on. It's all anonymous. So Angela, when you are ready, you can pull that poll up. So Jane Doe, a resident of the city of Calgary, has contributed $3,000 to a candidate running for city council. If she wishes to contribute to her friend's election campaign in a neighboring rural municipality, how much can she donate to her? So we'll let that run for a couple of seconds here. Coming in, fast and furious. A few more people answer. Okay, so we'll share these results. So it would be up to 5,000 as option those. So Jane, as an Alberta resident, she can donate up to a maximum of $5,000 to either of those candidates. Okay, so on to the next slide. So the duties of a candidate. Candidates, whether self-funded or not, must open a campaign bank account once total contributions to the candidate's campaign exceeds $1,000. The duties of a candidate when it comes to election finances include section 147.3 of the LAEA. Candidates must ensure that a dollar value is placed on non-monetary donations. So for example, if a location for your campaign headquarters is donated, what would the weekly or monthly rental charge be? Assign a value to this donation, as a receipt and documentation of the donation will be required. Candidates may want to keep in mind to be cautious of expenses inadvertently made out of their own campaign. Be sure that all costs are recognized for receipting and to ensure limits are adhered to. A receipt shall be issued for every contribution received in a form acceptable to the local jurisdiction. So returning officers, you will want to be sure you have that conversation sooner rather than later if you have not already provided that direction to candidates. So just in case you didn't catch that, ensure that a receipt is provided against each and every donation. Elections Alberta provides on their website what receipts at the provincial level should contain. So you would have the contributor's name, contributor's address, amount contributed, date the contribution was made or received by the individual, the date the official contribution receipt was issued, and type of contribution. Was it money, cash, and in kind? The candidate must keep records for 3 years following the date on which the disclosure statements were required to be filed. This is under section 147.4. For the 2021 general election, the deadline to file a disclosure statement is March 1st, 2022. So a little math this afternoon, you would retain those records until March 1st, 2025. And candidates must ensure they provide direction on process to their official agent and any other person who is authorized to incur campaign expenses and accept or solicit contributions on behalf of the candidate. And this direction can come through the form of a simple memo. So I just want to check in with everyone. We're about halfway through. Just want to see how it's going. Are we going too fast? Are we going too slow? I see there are some questions coming in, but I'm not I'm hoping that Lucian's capturing them. So, oh, I see an all good from Beth. That's great. So that's, there's Beth and I out there. That's perfect. Love it. I will just keep talking to Beth. Oh, thanks, Dawn. Wonderful. So it's good to see there's a few of you that are keeping up. So hopefully the rest of you are feeling the same way. Keep asking those questions. Like I said, we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. We are making progress, and I hope I've captured your attention, and the rest of you haven't left. So that's I see a couple more coming through. So that's good. Those candidates are going to come to you. They're going to have questions. They're going to be asking you that process. They're going to be performed. So I hope you're feeling good and comfortable. So that's your midway pep talk. So we're going to keep moving on to the next slide, fundraising functions. So candidates may wish to engage in those fundraising functions for various reasons. So the gross income, the total of all income from any fundraising function, must be recorded by the candidate on whose behalf the function was held. So the sale of tickets must be determined under two options. So option one, if the individual charge is $50 or less, the contribution amount is 50% of the ticket price, but only if the purchaser requests a contribution receipt. $50.01 to $100, the contribution receipt amount is the ticket price less $25. Over $100, the contribution receipt amount is 75% of the ticket price. So option two is the amount of the contribution is the difference between the price of the ticket and the fair market value of what the ticket entitles the bearer to obtain. And the price paid at a fundraising function in excess of the fair market value at that time for goods or services received is considered to be a contribution to the candidate's election campaign. The returning officer manual provides a table which outlines examples of fundraising events and how to determine that contribution portion of tickets or admission. And next slide is loans. Candidates may borrow money from a financial institution and must record all loans and their terms. As well, they must report accordingly to their local jurisdiction. This next statement gets a little wordy, but I'll read it out and then we'll break it down together. So an Alberta resident may make a payment on behalf of the borrower. Any payment made by a person becomes a contribution by that individual and a contribution accepted by the borrower if the individual is not reimbursed by the borrower before the borrower is required to file a disclosure statement. So hopefully you caught all that, but we'll put it in layman's terms. If an Alberta resident contributes to a candidate's loan and the candidate accepts the contribution, it falls under the contribution limitations covered under section 147.2. However, the candidate could repay the Alberta resident back for the payment before the next required disclosure statement is due, and it is no longer a contribution. So a candidate will identify loans on their disclosure statement. So campaign disclosure statements. Candidates must file campaign disclosure statement no later than March 1st following the general election. So in our case, that's March 1st, 2022, and the disclosure statement must include so contributions less than $50, the total amount of contributions received during the campaign period that did not exceed $50 in the aggregate from any single contributor. Contributions exceeding $50, so the total amount contributed together with the contributor's name and address for each contributor whose contributions during the campaign period exceeded $50 in the aggregate. The total amount of contributions received outside the campaign period, the total amount from fundraising functions, the total amount of other revenue, so this possibly would be a loan, total amount of campaign expenses, and be sure you're thinking of all expenses and assign a dollar amount, itemized capital expense report, setting out the campaign expenses incurred by the candidate, total amount paid out of the candidate's own funds, not reimbursed from the candidate's campaign fund, total amount of surplus, including any surplus from previous campaigns, and the amount of any deficit. So you can see this list is extremely detailed, and candidates will want to ensure they are documenting every expense and every contribution for an open and transparent process. And a candidate who has incurred campaign expenses or received contributions of $50,000 or more shall file a review engagement with the disclosure statement. The Charter of Professional Accounting Act identifies the review engagement, and candidates may wish to engage an accountant to complete the process. So if a candidate withdraws throughout the campaign period, they would also need to complete the campaign disclosure statement. The municipality must ensure the documents filed under this section are available to the public during regular business hours for 4 years after the election. And it had been asked in the past, how does a returning officer encourage the disclosure statements to come in? Possibly an email group to stay in contact with your candidates as the campaign period goes on, paper trail, contact for reference if needed. In an upcoming slide, the penalties for not submitting a disclosure statement is outlined. You might include that information to address those ramifications of not submitting the disclosure statements. And hopefully that would encourage your candidates to submit the necessary forms. So moving on to campaign surplus. Surplus, I'm thinking of Slurpees. It's too cold for that. So if a candidate has a surplus, they must, within 60 days after filing the disclosure statement, donate to a registered charity any amount that is in excess of $1,000. Once the amount is under $1,000, they may retain all or any portion of the amount and donate all or any portion of that amount to a registered charity. So just as a recap, a registered charity is defined in the Income Tax Act. A candidate must then, within 30 days after the expiration of the 60-day period referred to above, file an amended disclosure statement showing the surplus has been dealt with. So we'll walk through that using a disclosure statement submitted on March 1st. So it comes in, submitted March 1st, 2022. If a surplus is shown, the candidate must deal with that surplus to bring the total below $1,000 by April 30th, 2022. If a candidate donates an amount to a registered charity, the candidate must, within 30 days, file an amended disclosure statement by May 30th, 2022. And this section applies to a candidate whether or not they were elected. So campaign deficit. So candidates that show a deficit on their disclosure statement must eliminate that deficit within 60 days after filing the disclosure statement. So we know the disclosure statement, it's due on or before March 1st, 2022, and 60 days following is April 30th. However, note the wording in the legislation. It states after filing the disclosure statement. So that clock is going to start once the disclosure statement is filed. But for ease of discussion today, we're going to stick with the March 1st date as the filing date. So candidates may accept contributions within that 60-day period. So if we're sticking with March 1st, 60 days, March 1st to April 30th. So within that 60-day period, they may accept contributions to eliminate a deficit. This is an exception to the contribution rule. So an additional $5,000 in contributions from individuals or $10,000 from a candidate's own funds can be contributed to eliminate that deficit. So just to summarize, in the 2022 year, a candidate could collect $5,000 or personally contribute $10,000 in the aggregate for the next general election, and they can also collect additional $5,000 contributions or personally contribute $10,000 within that 60-day period following March 1st to eliminate the deficit. So if a candidate had a $20,000 deficit, they could contribute $10,000 of their own funds and 2 contributions of $5,000 from individuals. Candidates will have to look when they're accepting those donations to eliminate the deficit. If they collect more than what the deficit is, their next disclosure statement will now reflect that surplus. So the candidate has 30 days after that 60-day period to file an amended disclosure statement showing that the deficit has been eliminated. These are similar dates to a candidate dealing with a campaign surplus. As provided in the candidate's duties, records of contributions and expenses are retained by the candidate for a period of 3 years following the date disclosure statements were required to be filed. So, as we said, we're going to stick with March 1st, 2022 as the date submitted. We're going to retain those records until March 1st, 2025. Under Section 205 of the LAEA, a local jurisdiction, returning officer, or the registrar within a reasonable time must refer any complaint or allegation received by the local jurisdiction, returning officer, or registrar under Part 5.1 or Part 8 to the election commissioner. As well, report any act or omission that in the local jurisdiction's returning officer's or registrar's opinion likely constitutes an offense under Part 5.1 or Part 8 to the election commission. So late filing. So this is my slide. I asked for forgiveness last weekend at this point, and I think it was granted, and I'll do the same here. I'm about to break the #1 rule of PowerPoint. Don't read from the slide. But the good stuff's on the next slide, but we need to go through this one first. So I will just read from the slide. A candidate has until March 1st to file their disclosure statement. Failure to file will result in a late filing fee. 10 days to make payment or a report is transmitted to council. There's 30 days notice to the candidate to submit that late filing fee, and the local jurisdiction may file with the Court of Queen's Bench. So on the next slide here, we put some dates in so we can hopefully clarify each of these steps. So March 1st, the disclosure statement is due. Failure to submit is a $500 late filing fee. March 11th is the 10-day deadline to submit the form. There's no requirement to advise council if that form is submitted. On March 12th, you would transmit a report to council on the late filing. This may be in the form of a report to council at their next meeting with administration, seeking how council wishes to make the report public. So March 31st, $500 late filing fee is not paid. Local jurisdiction would send a notice to the candidate indicating the amount of the late filing fee that is required to be paid. And April 1st, the candidate fails to comply by this date, they're guilty of an offense and liable to a fine of not more than $5,000. The local jurisdiction may file a copy of the notice with the clerk of the Court of Queen's Bench, and at this point, the file is transferred to the election commissioner's office. So it's important to note Section 147.8 provides for the allowance of a candidate to apply within the 60-day period following the date the report is made public to the court for relief. So going to our timeline, March 11th, deadline to submit the reports made public on that date, you'd have the 60 days. And the late filing fee is payable to the local jurisdiction office. So offenses relating to contributions, the LAEA outlines the offense and fines of prohibited organizations or persons contributing sections of the LAEA. A candidate may want to engage in legal counsel if they are found to be in contravention of these sections. And next slide, regulations. So at this time, there are no regulations in place for the 2021 general election, but it is good to be aware that this provision is in place. And next slide, transitional period. There are transitional provisions at the end of Part 5.1 that address contributions made to candidates during the time period between January 1st, 2018 and when Bill 23, an Act to Renew Local Democracy in Alberta, received first reading on November 5th, 2018 and royal assent on December 11th, 2018. If candidates are uncertain of how contributions received in these transitional periods were impacted by Bill 23, they should seek legal independent advice to ensure they did not contribute any provisions relating to contributions during these time periods, and they remain eligible to become a candidate in the 2021 general election. So as another NFL season wraps up, if you are an NFL fan, you would know Drew Brees, and I have to take a quote from one of the good ones. And our football drought begins as the Super Bowl happened on Sunday, and hopefully your team was the winning team. Mine was, so I was happy on Sunday. Others not so much in my household, but that's okay. As I see it now, we're left with a whole lot more time for election prep, so that's a good thing. So I want you all to remember our office is here to support you along the way, and please, please, please have some fun. This is a long drawn out process, and it's not a race. So if this is your first election or your 20th election, it's safe to say you learn something new every time. And of course, we learn by listening to our colleagues, asking questions, and this year is going to bring plenty of new experiences with the possibility of Senate election and the referendum votes and the integration of how those practices mold themselves into our general election process. It's going to take extra communication to ensure those residents are aware that the voting process is going to look different come October. But I'm a firm believer that accomplishments in life must be celebrated. So even just 5 minutes for a selfie high five, because it's COVID and you can't touch anyone. So give yourselves a selfie high five and share that joy with your team, right? A great team is your most important investment when it comes to this process. And when that date rolls around to destroy your election material, don't let it pass without fully realizing what it was that you just achieved. My messaging from Tuesday remains the same. You can all accomplish this. Just believe in the process. And like I said, don't hesitate to call us when you have a question or just to talk out an approach. Sometimes having a new set of ears to listen is all it takes. So Angela's popped up the resource slide that I mentioned earlier. So there's some links here, the email addresses. So if you've got questions or just wanting to do a little bit of looking up of some stuff on your own, those are there. You can keep those for future reference. Alberta Education resources are there, and Levon Adams' email, phone numbers there if you have questions with regards to those school elections. So keep that handy. So we are going to turn over to the questions we received throughout the session. So I'm just gonna kind of start at the top and work our way through. So thanks to Lucienne for capturing all of these. So first one being, can you send out the materials for module 3 as the link from Eventbrite didn't work to download them? So I'm going to speak for Angela, and I will say that we could. I have a little follow-up piece, but I might as well say it now that we are going to have a survey come out after we wrap up today, and just asking you for your feedback on how much, I was going to say how much you enjoyed this session, or maybe you didn't enjoy it, but hopefully you did. I'm just asking you for your feedback, and I know I would appreciate hearing how it went. So with that email survey, we can include the materials from module 3, so you have those. Are we expecting other specific form updates other than Form 5? I have to say at this point, all I'm aware of is Form 5. So continue to watch that election forms page for anything new there. And what about the Education Act? Like we said, it's on that resource page. There is a link to Alberta Education information, as well as Levon Adams, her email and phone number. What would be an example of a permitted organization? There is not an example. It's, all organizations would be prohibited. Can you provide ACT sections for this topic? And in bracket was fundraising. So I'm going to take it. It's specific to fundraising, and that was, it's in the LAEA sections, or section 147.31 for reference. Does the ministry plan to provide a similar presentation for candidates? And my understanding is that the associations are currently looking at putting on a session for the candidates. So you'll want to watch for them for any further information coming out. Is it the responsibility of the candidate to file by March 1st, 2022, or is there a responsibility by the returning officer? So yes, the responsibility of the candidate would file with the secretary supporting the process. So the candidate is going to want to follow those dates, because as we went through in the presentation, there are specific dates that would have to be adhered to. Otherwise, you're looking at late filing fees and eventually the transfer to Elections Alberta. How will the CAO know if they have filed? Hopefully upon receipt of the document with the CAO. So once that candidate has filed with the municipality, the CAO would end up with that document. And what happens if they're not able to clear the deficit, especially if they can only contribute $10,000? So candidates will have to ensure that that deficit is cleared up. And one thing they may want to do is, as they're going through the campaign period, ensure that they're monitoring their expenses and contributions so that it's not a surprise at the 11th hour that they've got a deficit of $50,000 and how are they going to address that. So you might want to monitor as the campaign period year is going through. So is Municipal Affairs working on, or when will Municipal Affairs have the forms to use for when and if a report to council has to be done? So there is nothing currently in the forms regulation. And if there's no form within that regulation, the municipality would have the ability to create one that works for their own requirement. So as there is not one in the forms regulation now, you, the municipality, could look to how you wish to see that. So those are the questions that I had. There's a couple like more like for Pamela. For Pamela, okay. And I know Pamela is here. If she wants to, do we have to unmute her or she do that as a co-host? Okay.
Hi.
Oh, she's there. Hi.
I am. Okay, so yes, I do see there is a couple questions in regards to Senate election. So is there a certain date by which a Senate election has to be called? So the Senate election has to be called 14 days prior to nomination day. So the same nomination day that you're using for the municipal election. So we have calculated that to be September 7th because September 6th is a holiday, so it goes to the next day. So that's the latest that we would know that a Senate election was occurring. And is there any compensation to municipalities for adding Senate or referendum to their voting process? Yes, there is a grant regulation that is attached to both. So there's a Senate election grant regulation and a referendum grants regulation. You can find both of them on Queen's Printer. They have the same funding formula, and it differs whether or not you are a municipality that is already holding an election. So if you're running an election, I believe it's $1 per person in your municipality, whereas if you're not running an election, then it's $2, but you should refer to the regulation to make sure that you understand how that would apply for your municipality. Did you guys see anything else in there about Senate or referendum for me?
I think those were the only two at this point in time.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Pamela. Any news on changes to special ballot provisions? I don't believe anything has come out. Yeah, Angela's agreeing with me. So I have not seen anything. As soon as we know, we'll let you know, but sometimes you know before us. So is there more than a $10,000 deficit? Oh, if there is more than a $10,000 deficit, can a candidate contribute more than the $10,000? So that 60-day period speaks to a $10,000 limit for what a candidate can contribute of their own funds. So a deadline to call a provincial referendum. I'm going to call back my phone a friend. I'm going to phone a friend and meet Pamela.
Okay, so the deadline to call the referendum is exactly the same time. So it's set that 14 days before nomination day. And so that is so that we will know on the exact same day if we are doing a referendum and a Senate election. Of course, it's important to know both for being able to do your ballots and figuring out a lot of pieces. So same day, September 7th is when we should know that. The one advantage we'll have on referendum is that order in council will also include the referendum questions. So on September 7th, we will know what the ballots require for the referendum questions and what those answers are. Whereas for Senate election, we will be waiting for the nomination period to close. So we won't have information for the Senate election ballot until September 20th at 2 p.m. when nominations close. Can the Senate and referendum voting go on the same ballot as the municipal election, or does it have to be separate? So there's going to be kind of a different process whether or not you're using a tabulator. So for municipalities that are using a tabulator ballot, yes, you can consolidate. So you can have the municipal election pieces, Senate and referendum together. We have been talking with the primary vendors, ES&S and Dominion, about how to fit this and what that might look like, because it can be a lot of contests and questions potentially. If you are doing a hand count, however, we plan to have the Senate election and the referendum ballot as separate ballots. So they would go into separate ballot boxes, and a lot of that is just thinking about what that count process is going to look like at the end of the night, so that you can focus in on each of those contests separately, because we anticipate that there will be multiple referendum questions, and Senate candidates were usually picking a multiple. In the past, we have picked up to 3 candidates, so we think having separate ballots when doing a paper hand count is preferred. For the Senate and referendum grant, do we use our most recent census? I assume it's population, not eligible voters, or does the province have an estimated population that we would use? It is going to be population. It is not eligible voters, but I do believe that Municipal Affairs is working on what that number is that would be used. Our plan is in Module 5, which is going to be towards the end of March. Someone from the grants area will be coming forward to talk about how that grant process is going to work. I think that's all the questions for me.
Okay. So the question was regarding to highlights in previous session. As I said in the messaging, the municipality would look if they're going outside of what the legislated requirements were. So look to your municipality, how you wish to take that direction. Kevin added some information on the base funding for the regulations. And then the next question, does Elections Alberta? I will let Pamela answer that one.
Okay. So does Elections Alberta provide the ballots for Senate elections and referendums? For those municipalities that are doing a paper ballot hand count, yes, Elections Alberta will be providing you with your ballots. If you are using a tabulator, however, we are not providing those ballots because, of course, you need to get those from your vendor. They need to work with the rest that you're using for the municipality. We are aware that if you're using a tabulator ballot and whether or not you're using multiple pages, double-sided, long ballots, we understand that those can be read by the same tabulator, so there should be no reason why you would have to get an extra tabulator into the polls. And there will be more information about this in Module 5. So Module 5 is all about Senate election and referendum. So we'll be talking about kind of all these pieces that come into it. There is also a information, the first module that we had done, we had a lot of information about Senate and the roles and responsibilities between municipalities and Elections Alberta, who provides what. You might want to go back and take a look at that one because it answers some of these questions at a high level if you need some of these answers before the end of March. Yes, so the longer retention period for Senate ballots, that is correct. Senate and referendum do have a longer retention period than the Senate ballots. So if you do use one tabulator, you keep everything in the same ballot box, then the longer retention period applies then to the entire ballot box because Senate and referendum is in there. Will there be cost sharing in ballots for municipalities that are using tabulators? So right now, the legislation is clear that municipalities that are using tabulators are responsible for their own ballots. I can tell you right now that my preference is that if we have to go to a multi-page ballot to fit all the contests, I think it is preferable for the voters to use a 2-page ballot rather than a double-sided ballot. I am concerned that if we have double-sided, that people might miss what's on the back. And I understand that there is an increased cost in having 2 pages rather than 1 page that's double-sided. So there's a difference in printing, of course, because there's more paper involved. I am looking into that to see if there is anything that we can do to assist. But right now, the message is municipalities with tabulators are responsible for those costs. I will have more information in March, though, whether or not there's anything more we can do there.
Okay. Just want to remind everyone that our office is here to support you and help you to remember, have some fun along the way. This is a long, onerous process. There's some stressful days ahead, but just try and have some fun along it. I'm sure one or two of us can think of our first election where we could have changed our shirts every 20 minutes because we were sweating like crazy. Or if you didn't, well, I wish I had you on my team during my first election in 07. But I'll never forget sealing that last ballot box during that time and thinking, wow, oh my, I really did this. And 6 weeks later was the best day of my life, but don't tell my husband or kids, when that shredding truck showed up and I threw all those boxes into that truck and I thought, that's it, I did it. And it went smoother than I could have ever imagined. So you can all accomplish this, just believe in the process. And as we know, there's no degree program for becoming a returning officer. We learn by asking questions and learning from others' experience. So don't hesitate ever to call us when you have a question or just to bounce an idea off. Sometimes all it takes is just to talk it out loud. So we will move on to questions. And I know that Angela and Lucienne and Kevin have been busily in the background taking down your notes. So I'm just going to jump to those. So the first one was, will there be a training manual and or module for summer villages? So yes, that's coming towards the end of April. So watch for that. So all candidates, including school board candidates, must complete a Form 5 with their nomination form. Yes, that form is to be submitted by nomination day, but of course it would be great if municipalities can have that come together with your nomination form or their nomination form, pardon me. The section reference for those wanting to view nomination forms, that's section 28, subsection 6. And will there be a candidate training session prior to filing of nomination deadline? So the associations are looking at a training session for the candidates. They're spearheading that. So again, something to watch for. Can you spend more than contributions? Can you run a debt? So a deficit would have to be covered. If a candidate ends up with one, they'd have to, I guess, manage that as they're going through their campaign period. So using their own personal contribution that they can put to the campaign, but they'd want to be cautious of running a debt. So records are kept until 2025. So correct, it'll be obviously dependent on that date of the disclosure statement and when that was submitted. So who keeps the records for 3 years? So the candidate keeps the records of contributions and expenses for 3 years. And the municipality retains the disclosure statement for 4 years after the election and makes them available for public inspection. So a copy of the slides, I believe the slides were linked in the email from yesterday. So if you don't have that, then email us obviously at ma.lgsmail and we can provide you a copy. Are candidates required to fill out Form 5 before nomination day? Yes, so as I said earlier, they would be submitted by nomination day. The financial information is for our information and to help explain, guide candidates. However, it is their responsibility to manage and report on this, correct? So yes, the candidate would be responsible to ensure that the information is provided. And yes, disclosure statements are required even if there were no contributions made. Everybody needs to submit one of those disclosure statements if they were a candidate. So from a small village with no campaigning and no money received by candidates, what are the forms that are needed to be completed? So it's the same forms as any other municipality would have to be submitted for those individuals. For the candidates that are not successful in winning in the election, how do we force a disclosure statement? So that would be through those late filing fees, the different dates that we walked through, and then of course the referral to Elections Alberta at the point in time that they've missed all of the legislative deadlines. So is it the responsibility of the returning officer to follow up with any candidate for the disclosure statement? So it's the responsibility of the candidate, but I suppose the returning officer could reach out. Yeah, email or provide a letter, just letting the candidates know. that that requirement is still outstanding and they need to submit it. So is it correct that it is the candidate's responsibility to understand and be accountable for complying with all campaign contribution and campaign reporting obligations? If a candidate has questions, is it correct that we should be aware of general information, but the candidates should be responsible to know the details of what they are responsible for? So yeah, going back to that previous slide that we talked about. So the candidate needs to be aware and of what's going on. They need to be aware of what their responsibilities are, so making every reasonable effort and being cautious. So before taking those contributions, before accepting a contribution, referring or making sure that is that a prohibited organization? Is it an Albertan? Just doing some due diligence. So who is the late filing fee paid to? That's to the local jurisdiction. And yes, campaign disclosure statements are filed by every candidate with or without contributions. Whether or not they've incurred expenses with or without contributions, they will require a disclosure statement. So that's the questions I had.
I have a couple.
Okay, it sounds like a couple more have come through.
Okay, so we had a question about when we can expect some of the forms to be updated. So those are being updated as quickly as possible. We have to work with Service Alberta to do so, but they do have a plan and a priority to get those forms updated and on our website, but hopefully that will be as soon as they can in the next few months. I don't have an exact date, but it is on their list to do. The question is Form 5 new in this election? I believe it was in place for the last election. It had a different name, right, but it was still that form for candidate information. And as Jennifer had said, it has to be filed before nomination day. And of course, it would be nice that the candidate files at the same time as their Form 4. But if they don't file it at that time, you still have to accept their nomination papers. And you might want to have your Form 5s available at your office in case someone doesn't have it or isn't aware of it. And when they file their papers, you could have them fill that out quickly. There's not a whole lot of information on there that's required. Or you can hand it to them and ask them to email, to bring it back in when they have it completed. And if there is anything changing on that form, I believe they can send you an email to update it that way. They don't have to come in once they filed that form. If someone calls to ask if anyone has submitted nomination papers, are returning officers permitted to share this information? So either the number of candidates and/or names of candidates, or does that individual actually need to come into the office to view the nomination papers? So as Jennifer had mentioned earlier, Section 28(6) requires those papers to be made available for public inspection. If municipalities want to go over and above that requirement, as well as the requirement to post the names 48 hours after, within 48 hours after nomination closes in September, we had mentioned that if you want to do that, you should have the appropriate consents from the candidates in place, as well as a policy to set out when, how often the names are posted. If you're going to post them every month, every few weeks, what your process is going to be so that everyone's aware. In terms of saying that people have actually submitted nomination forms without providing any personal information, I don't think there's an issue with that necessarily. If you want to say, yeah, no, there's no one submitted forms or two people have submitted forms, that's probably fine. And if people want to come in and see who has, then they can certainly do that under 28(6). So hopefully that answers that question. We've had a lot of phone and emails about that. Hope it's more clear for everybody. So which form is the campaign disclosure statement? It's not Form 5, it's Form 26, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, that form has not been updated on our website. And that'll, like I said earlier, that'll be updated in the next little bit here, hopefully. Because there have been some changes on that form, obviously, with the limits that are on there. So municipalities can post candidate names now if they have submitted their papers. You can, if you have had like a release of information form or a consent from candidates and you have a policy in place to address that process of what you're going to do or how you're going to do it. Okay, and Lorraine reminded me, thanks Lorraine. The regulation is completed, the forms regulation on Queen's Printer. So if you want to look at the forms that are totally updated on the regulation but haven't been updated on our website, you can certainly take a look at that. And if you need to use that information to create your form, I believe that's something you can do. So yes, thanks Lori, that's how it's looking right now. The regulation is done, like the changes have been made to the forms, but they haven't been updated on our website through Service Alberta. So hopefully that's clear for everybody now. Posting of candidates' names in the Local Authorities Election Act is also in Section 28, subsection 10. So you have within 48 hours of the close of nominations on nomination day to post those names at the office of the candidates. Okay, another question, section 34.3 says after 12 noon on nomination day. So 34.3. Just looking on our NDA. Okay, we might have to look at that question.
Yeah.
34 deals with election by acclamation.
Yeah. So those papers will remain after 12 noon on nomination day until the term of office to which the filed nomination paper relates has expired. So acclaimed nomination papers would be available for viewing. And 2810 is 48 hours after the close of nomination days for an election. But we can review that and we can always respond. Graham. Okay.
Okay, another question, if there is no release of information form filled out, are those forms still available for public viewing? Yes, for section 28.6. So if someone calls in and asks for names of potential candidates, I have to give the name of potential candidates submitted so far. Not unless your policy is in place and you have those candidate consents that you can, if someone's calling to ask, you would have to tell them that they would have to come into the office to view those forms if they wish. That's prior to nomination. Once we hit nomination day, there's 48 hours in which the returning officer has to post those names to make them public in the office. If a candidate does not file their financial disclosure, are they removed from council?
The removal from council would be based on the MGA.
And I believe there's in section 22, when it talks about candidate eligibility, it also talks about people that if they had contravened some of these sections to report their disclosures. So if that should change after they're elected, there might be a possibility that someone could challenge that and that they could be disqualified. So section 22, subsection 1.2 talks about that. If there was a report or if there was some sort of court, the candidate wanted dispensation through the court or something like that, there are some provisions for that in that section. There's still a couple. So there is no provision in the legislation that requires a policy to be put in place. The only provisions that are there, the minimum provisions, is the public inspection in the office, and then the release of names after nomination day. So those as well are subject to FOIP. So that's why there could be a candidate consent that would override that. That would allow the names to be published before over and above those provisions. If my office is closed, how do I have people inspect the form? Right, so yeah, for COVID reasons, I suppose you could make an appointment with people to come in, or we might have to get a little bit more feedback on that.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that requirement is met.
You can also use electronic in theory for making something available under the Act, at least under current ministerial orders.
Okay, so hopefully we caught that. So using an electronic means to have that available through the COVID orders. So I think, Neil, we can provide that further information. I don't have the MO number in front of me, but we can let you know that offline. Okay, so Carolyn's offered up under section 41D of the FOIP Act, a municipality could disclose a candidate. So thank you, Carolyn. So I think, seeing that it's 10:21 and I believe we've answered the questions that are here. So if there are more that are coming up, so before nomination day, are they a candidate? So the campaign period opened January 1st, nomination period started January 1st. If they submit a form, they are a candidate. Okay, so if there are further questions, please feel free to email correct me if I'm wrong, Angela, the ma.lgsmail@gov.ab.ca, because I'm sure the questions are going to continue, right? As people have situations that come before them or think of something. I know elections can draw up a lot of the, well, what ifs, because we all have you would never believe what I just got told or just got asked or what I heard during an election process. There's a lot of them. So just to let everybody know that there is going to be a survey coming out after Tuesday's session. So Tuesday, February 9th, we are going to be running this session again. So if you wish to attend and hear me talk for another hour and Steve for about 20 minutes, then please join us. We'll be following the same format. We'll again have our question period. But please, after Tuesday, watch for that survey. I know I personally would love to hear your feedback on how you thought today went. And if there's something that's missing or clarify, that would be wonderful. And so, as we say, another module down, and we are creating the returning officer's manual as we complete each module. So by the end of the 10th module, we hope to leave you with a wonderful gift of a returning officer manual that may be marked up with some of your own personal little edits. But we know that there are so many moving parts and we cannot capture every single instance, but we hope that you are beginning to see this process unfold and your comfort level is growing. Angela is pointing at me, so I think there's maybe one more thing that I need to mention.
Right, I'm just going to reiterate, Bernice had asked about an election calendar. So on the municipal elections overview page, there is a calendar kind of checklist tool that I've created that hopefully everyone has can take a look at, and it does set out kind of the deadlines for certain processes like advertising and everything like that. So please take a look at that, and if you have any questions on it, let me know, and I can certainly answer any of those questions, or if hopefully it's still working properly online. Sometimes we hear people can't access it, but yeah, it's on the municipal elections overview page with all of our other resources, with all our returning officer manuals, and all of that is on that one page. Yeah.
I see there was a link posted in the chat
Thank
box.
you very much for posting that link.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to copy that, that would be great. Yeah, so as I said, we'll run this session again on Tuesday. It'll be at 1:30 in the afternoon. And then in late February, we will be back with the next module, which is the third-party advertising. So with that, I will say goodbye and we'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you.